Thank you for inviting me to
Yeah,
this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely. It's great to meet you. So, I want to begin our journey before we get into the book by
Okay.
asking you about COVID. It was such a big time of change for all of us, put a lot of things in perspective. How did you get through that COVID era, and how has it changed the way that you do things today?
That's a great question. So I was teaching during COVID. I was teaching at a day and boarding school. And when it first hit, we went remote with our students. And it was just so sad for some students, those who would be graduating. Um, it was a different situation for me because I was still able to work, so that was good. But of course, it was a different kind of situation working from home, which in some ways was kind of nice because I didn't have to get in my car and do the whole commuting thing. But I also joined some writing groups, some remote writing groups. So that was good. I was a member of the International Women's Writing Guild, and during that time, we formed a writing group of about five or six of us from all different parts of the US. So that was fun because then we were sharing what we were working on, that everyone was working on a memoir. So it was a specific memoir writing group. And I like that. I think the hardship was family. I have a daughter who is living in New York. Finally, they were able to come. It was always the kind of thing where you wanted to make sure everybody had been isolated long enough that they weren't sick and they hadn't seen anyone, and making sure you stayed with just those individuals who you knew would be okay, limiting time going out to stores or whatever. So yeah, there was more online relationships. It was the beginning of the Zoom era.
Yeah.
So having this kind of online, Zoom relationships was really a different,
Yeah.
a different way of life, but one that, for me personally, I don't think I was as hurt as others. Like no one who was close to me died. This is a big relief. So many people, I live close to New York City. My daughters lived in the New York area. I remember having some real anxiety about them becoming sick or their partners becoming sick and what that would mean. Thankfully, everybody stayed well through that. But yeah.
So let's get into kind of the entirety of your career leading up to your memoir right now. I'm going to put you in front of 13-year-olds at career day, and one of the kids wants to know what you do and what you've done for a living. How do you answer with what your careers look like?
Okay, thank you. I've been teaching since I finished college. When I first graduated from Syracuse University, it was not a great time for getting an elementary education position, which was what I was certified to teach. But I did teach in a preschool, and I also tutored and worked part time. And I went back to school and got a master's in special education because that field was just opening up with a new federal law that had been passed to have students educated in the least restrictive environment. So my career has mostly been in education, starting out in elementary education, and then I had children. And so while my children were babies, I took different types of teaching opportunities. I taught at a university for a year. I taught as a long term sub in other settings. And I began always, I like to write. So, in the final phase of my career, I worked at Cheshire Academy, which is a private school. And I began there as a learning specialist, working one on one with students who were seeking help with study skills and test preparation. And after several years of doing that, I had an opportunity to lead their writing center. I became the director of the writing center. And that was something that didn't really exist. So I was not only directing it, I was developing it and putting it in place. And I would say that was probably the most fun I had had with my teaching career because I was teaching creative writing, and I was forming writing groups, and students would come to see me with whatever questions they may have had. So I do think that sometimes in our lives, if I was talking to young people, I would say that we think that we're interested in doing one thing, and we don't really know ourselves entirely. And knowing ourselves is an ongoing process. So it's okay to change careers. You might start with something that matches your general sensibilities, but the specifics around that may change. So I was always someone who liked to work with other people, who liked a job that had a dynamic to it, that it would change, that it wasn't going to be consistently the same every day. And teaching was very much like that, changes every day.
So let's take you to that career day when you were that age. What did you want to be when you grew up? What was your dream? Has it always been teaching?
Well, when I was really young, I had wondered about being a nurse, and I
Yeah.
was kind of discouraged from doing that by my mother, who did not present a very attractive picture of nursing with blood and vomit. So that didn't sound like fun. But one thing I had thought about, and which now I sort of, regret just a little bit, I was introduced to the idea of communications or journalism. But at that point, I thought journalism was sort of copy and paste, or who, what, where, when, how writing. It seemed very dry when I was young to consider being a journalist. However, I went to Syracuse that had this amazing Newhouse School of Communications, which is a fabulous, actually, school for journalism. So, in some ways, it's regrettable I didn't take advantage of enrolling or finding out more about that. So, I do think, when I was young, I thought about nursing or a degree in the healthcare industry. And then later, I dabbled with the idea of journalism. But my mother, who had been a teacher, and so many of the women in my life, older adults, were teachers or in education, and kind of posed this idea that it was a great career for a woman who might want to have a family. And I definitely wanted a family. So you could be home in the summers and home on the same vacations that your children are off from school. So that was a big draw to find my way to teaching.
So when I was in school, I wanted to get into sports broadcasting, and my dream was to go to Syracuse because that was
Oh,
Bob Costas's alma mater, and I knew how strong their journalism program was. So it's funny you mentioned Syracuse. It was definitely on the radar. So let me ask you this. What were your influences growing up that made you want to get to teaching and to write and to put this book out? What were some of the things that you were seeing, the seeds that were planted that ultimately became your destiny?
well, I love to read. So I was always reading. And then I had a friend when we were in middle school. We both liked to read and write, and we'd like to draw pictures. So we would like write these little blurbs and then share them. We were creating a character. We named him Bud. We thought that was the most hilarious name for a guy. And we'd write these little scenarios, and she would write something about Bud and Bud in school. And then I would pick it up and I'd respond to her writing. So we were kind of doing an exchange of writing. Other role models, as I said, my mother was a teacher, my aunt was a teacher. So those were role models for being in an educational environment. My mother's friends were teachers. Um, they were definitely role models for education. And also, there was a strong emphasis in my family on education, on getting my own education. Certainly, I was expected to go to college. My oldest brother is a doctor, which was also why I had thought about doing something in the sciences or in medicine, because, I think he was revered for his pursuit of medicine. And then my next older brother was a lawyer. So, but that, they were going through their graduate school studies when I was finishing high school and getting into college. Um, and basically, I did feel like I didn't know entirely. Also, when I was in high school, I was very active in theater. And I originally thought I was going to go to Syracuse as a theater major. And in fact, that's where I started. But when I got to Syracuse and joined their theater department, I didn't click with that environment as I had in my own high school. I loved my high school friends. We were all in theater together. We were in a repertory company. We were very close to one another. So I had always been, I would say, I was always immersed in things like theater, art. I loved drawing and art, and I loved writing and reading. So my interest always bent towards the arts, writing, reading, performing, that kind of thing.
So, what kind of books, what kind of literature were you into? What was really influential on you early on?
Wow. Let's think. So many books. Of course, I read J.D. Salinger when I was a young person. I loved Kurt Vonnegut. I remember reading Cat's Cradle. I loved Catch 22 and Joseph Heller. And then as I began, when I was in college, I loved Lolita Nabokov.
Yeah.
I loved Notes from Underground. I started reading, I love short stories. Um, and then as I progressed, and in more recent years, I started reading memoirs. I just love memoirs. So I read, this is very much more recently, of course, but Crying in H Mart. I read Wave, which is about the tsunami. I I just decided to fully immerse myself in memoir writing so I could see how other memoirists did it, like The Glass Castle. I love Cheryl Strayed Wild. I just really wanted to immerse myself in memoir writing. As a really young person, I did love reading biographies. I just soaked them up. I remember going through a phase of reading biographies like Louis Pasteur or Madame Curie or Helen Keller's story. So I always loved this idea of true life stories. As a youngster, that was
Yeah.
important to me.
So, as a writer, do you remember the first piece that you wrote, you got a visceral response that kind of made you think, huh, I can do this. This makes sense.
Well, I think first piece that I had published was about ice skating with my father at a park called Ritter's Pond. And I wrote it and I submitted it to Long Island Women. I think it was maybe the only magazine I submitted it to, and they accepted it and they offered to pay me. And I was just so shocked. Somebody wanted to pay me. I thought maybe they wanted me to pay them to have it in their magazine. So that was really like, wow, somebody really liked what I wrote and they actually want to pay me for this. This is amazing. And then when I was teaching and I was forming those writing groups, and also I was doing other writing, I was writing for the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering. I had somebody I knew someone, and they were looking for a writer who would interview scientists in the state of Connecticut, scientists and engineers who had been awarded a prize for their work, and to interview them and translate their work into simpler, more layperson terms so it could be read by a broader audience. So I was doing that, and I kind of loved, interviewing these scientists and researchers about their work. So that was also going on while I was then. So let me back up. I had gone through a period of time when I wasn't employed, but I needed to be employed. So I was doing resume writing for other people and writing their kind of bios for their own opportunities to look for jobs. And in doing that, it involved taking pieces of information and kind of putting them together into an organized segment. But then when I was teaching at the Cheshire Academy and I was heading up the writing center, I was working on short stories, and I wrote a short story that was based on a tragic incident of a student that I had known. And that story was accepted for publication. And then in that group about my own memoir, I finally, after writing all kinds of stories and exchanging them with others in the writing group, I did write this piece that really encapsulated the beginning of my experience with my family of moving from the home that we had been living in to this government assisted housing unit and facing a very different time in our lives where my then husband was incarcerated and we were visiting him. And just the trauma of that experience, how it impacted my daughters and myself, and just writing a little bit about that. And when I shared that with other members of my writing group, they were just both shocked, but also very encouraging by way of saying that is really what you should be focusing on. Short stories, that's great, but you should be writing about this experience. So that's when I began to write about it. And then that piece, which I called Praying Before Idols, was sort of a little bit like a braided essay, and it was accepted for publication at Townsend University's Grub Street literary magazine. And then I began writing other essays that were about that time in my life. They each of them focused on a different moment, whether it was the tag sale to sell all of the things that had to be sold because we were now moving from our home to this small unit, or writing about visiting my then husband for the first time in prison with our family. And so we're writing about the sentencing hearing and going before the judge to talk about the impact that his sentencing would have on myself and our daughters.
So, who's been your hero, your inspirational force or muse, so to speak, to evolve to where you're at today, to put this memoir on paper and to be who you are?
I do think Cheryl Strayed, when I read Wild and read about her um, complicated relationship, her loving relationship with her mother, but the divorce that she was going through, and her attempt to try to find herself by hiking this, extremely arduous trail, the Pacific Trail, on her own, independent, like that just inspired me not only to write my story, but just to think about how we can transform our lives' experiences into something that is art in a way that others can read and find themselves within. And I feel that way about my memoir, although my memoir is very specifically about my experience being married to someone who was a white collar criminal and did end up being incarcerated for over 3 years. And that is a very specific story that I have. The overarching story and the theme is really bigger than that. And it is about marriage and about being in relationships where sometimes we don't feel that we have the power to really either assert ourselves or to recognize what is right before us because the stakes are so great. To say, you know what, this isn't working for me. I can't be in this relationship. And yet we have three little kids and we don't really have a career that we're falling back on and we don't know where we would go. Where would we go? Where would we live? How would we support ourselves? So those are the kinds of things that made it very difficult for me to make a radical change in my life. So sometimes it's only when we really are forced to hit rock bottom that we have to make these changes. And then the discovery process of who we are and our own inner strengths becomes more evident to us.
So, in this process of writing the memoir, you had to revisit some pretty dark memories of things that happened in your life. When you look back on it now, was it really excruciating to do that? And did it end up being cathartic? Is this journey of putting it out into the world and having your story out, has it felt like it's kind of, washed away the sins, so to speak?
I feel like, people talk about the writing as a catharsis. I wanted, I wanted to be clear in the writing that I didn't really want to pose myself as a victim. And nor did I want to pose my husband as a villain. I mean, I think that we were, both of us, in our own ways, delusional. And I had this vision of what my life should look like, where I thought I should be living this, kind of a very upper middle class life, if not middle class life, that I should have kids and I should have all of material, um, these material comforts that one is not necessarily entitled to have. And they don't necessarily bring us any kind of happiness or satisfaction. So the writing process caused me to reflect on the person who I was, the way in which I was sort of naively, innocently, superficially moving through my life. There were times when I felt um, uncertain of who I was. In fact, I had revisited other careers because, in so much as I loved being a parent, I would be this mom, but then I would really think, what else should I be doing? I didn't really think I wanted to go back to education after I started having children. I wasn't sure about that. I thought I should be doing something else that was somehow more important. I just struggled to really find myself and feel comfortable with who I was and feel comfortable in my skin, and always yearning to somehow prove myself, to prove my value or my importance. So, in writing about it, it forced me to investigate those emotions and that way of seeing myself in the world. And in terms of the dark times, yeah, I think that, there was a lot of sadness at that time, but in some ways, because I was working hard to just kind of keep everything together and to manage my children's lives and their schooling and keeping them afloat, that I didn't think that there was time to, there wasn't going to be any time to feel sorry for ourselves. We needed to just keep moving forward and carry on and do everything to keep up, again, still within this community. So in writing about it, I could look back and say, wow, I needed to have slowed myself down. I didn't have the kind of balanced view that I like to think that I have now. And again, a lot of this probably with maturity and with age. But yeah, I was swept up in all kinds of things at that particular phase of my life.
So, as a writer that loves literature, a lot of those books you mentioned, I absolutely love myself. I'm curious if you could, we document everything. There's all these films of, sports and music and all of this, but writers tend to not be in that boat because it's a more solitary act. So, I'm wondering if if you could watch any of those writers you mentioned or anybody that you've loved historically, watch how they create, how they write, how their process unfolded. Who would you love to have seen?
Well, it's an interesting thing because I have gone to writing conferences and I have heard people speak a little bit about their process. As you say, I think it's very individual. I suppose I love Anne Patchett, for example. She is someone who I just finished reading Truth and Beauty. I've read other works of hers. She was someone who I would love to know and be like a friend with. Um, but that said, I also talked about Charles Strayed, and you feel like you get to know these people because they are putting out works. You know, it's amazing to me how much they are publishing because people have asked me, "Oh, what are you working on? What else have you published?" And I'm working on smaller pieces, and I'm just beginning to think about what else I might write on a bigger scale. So yes, I would enjoy being friends, spending time with individuals who are very immersed in their art. And I imagine just like any of us, like they're writing, but they're also going to dinner with friends.
Yeah.
They're also, taking vacations and holidays. So they're living a life and maybe they are disciplined. I also read Anne Lamott, like just sitting yourself down in the chair and doing it. So, yes, I don't know if that really answers your
It does.
question.
It certainly does. So, Wendy, I'm curious. Everyone has a perception of you. family, friends, everyone that gets your book, everyone that knows you in all these different areas of your life. But you're the one that runs what we see. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Well, I like to think of myself as someone who is warm, empathetic, loving, but also witty and funny, creative, and deep and in touch with myself below the surface and intuitive about what others might be thinking and feeling. I'm always thinking about that, what other people might be thinking about any one situation. And yes, I'm investigative. I love research. I love learning about things all of the time.
So your memoir is a dream life. If anybody wants to get a copy or if they want to reach out, find out anything else that's going on in your world, where's the best place to go?
Well, they can find me on Instagram and Facebook. So those are two good places. But also, I have a website, www.wendyswift.com. But I think to really be in touch with what I'm doing on a regular basis, I would say social media. They can find me at Wendy J. Swift author on Instagram and Wendy Swift on Facebook. And of course, the book is available through Amazon, bookshop.org, Vine Leaves Press directly, and Amazon. Did I say Amazon? Yeah,
Yes.
Amazon.
And I will make it easy. I will put links in the show notes. Wendy, what a great story. Thank you so much for taking a minute out today. Best of luck with the book and everything else. I appreciate it.
Thank you for spending time with me. I really appreciate this so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you
Have a
bet.
great